Well, joining me now to look at the latest in politics and the coronavirus are Laura Stone. She's a political reporter for the Globe and Mail and works out of Toronto and Queen's Park. And Erica Ifill, who's a columnist for the Hill Times and co-host of the Bad and Bitchy podcast. Welcome to you both.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Erica, I just wanted to say the name of your podcast. It's so much fun to say. Both of you, very eventful days in both provinces and the country as a whole. I want to start with you, Laura. We saw the Ontario budget yesterday, the first pandemic budget in Ontario. A lot of money, the deficit is going to be a record deficit, $45 billion targeted specifically to COVID spending, much of it, though, has already been announced. How is it being received? Are there any surprises? How's it playing in Ontario?
Well, look, the biggest impact that the Ontario government wanted to have with this budget is the fact that they were having one and that they were having multi-year projections in the budget in regards to spending as well as the deficit. Martin, as you mentioned, it does have record spending, a record deficit this year, and it gave two scenarios for the next 2 years. But the deficits are going to be in the 30s and $20 billion figures, certainly not what the Ford government had hoped for when they came into office. So this truly is a budget for the pandemic times, and the government focused a lot on increasing health spending. I think one of the more curious elements of this budget, and something that a lot in the long-term care sector really leaned onto when it was announced, was the lack of details for this 4 hours of direct care that the government said that they would now take up after years of calls from unions and healthcare workers to increase. And we all saw the devastation that happened in the long-term care sector during this pandemic. There's no money attached to that in the budget. And so the opposition and the healthcare sector were very critical of the government for that and cast a lot of doubt on the sincerity of their pledge to increase this direct care promise, which is not going to be fulfilled until 2024, 2025.
What about, a lot of people are suggesting that if Ontario can produce a pandemic budget, why can't Ottawa? Are you hearing that around? Is that something that's now becoming a logical suggestion?
I think that's something that Ontario definitely wanted to point out with the creation of this budget. And I don't think it's any coincidence that we have Premier Ford and Finance Minister Rod Phillips in Ottawa today, touring around and meeting with some local stakeholders. I think they really wanted to come across as fiscally responsible as one could be during these times. Of course, they're spending a lot of money and the deficit is through the roof, but I do think they wanted to show Ottawa a little bit that it can be done. And of course, Martin, they also want to ask Ottawa for more money. This Canada Health transfer is a big issue, and I think we're going to see that really pushed a lot more from Ontario and the other provinces to increase significantly the money that provinces get from the federal government to pay for healthcare.
Okay, Erica, I want to ask you, being in Alberta, I mean, one of the things that people are noticing is things have changed so dramatically in Alberta just in the course of a few weeks. I mean, the beginning of this pandemic, Alberta was shipping wholesale its PPE, its ventilators and its masks and its product to the rest of Canada, as it basically had very high levels of testing and very low levels of infection. This week we saw rates skyrocket, and we are awaiting announcements from health authorities there for a crackdown. What is the atmosphere? How serious is the situation? How is that affecting the political culture there?
Well, it's very serious. As you may or may not know, Foothills Hospital had a huge outbreak here a few weeks ago. We're seeing increased rates of infection, and this lackadaisical attitude towards restrictions such as mass social gatherings and social distancing have become more important as we've seen these cases just explode. And I just want to say that I think the explosion of cases was entirely foreseeable, given what was happening around the rest of the country, and given that we have no immunity to this pandemic. We have no vaccine. So when the second wave was starting in Ontario and Quebec especially, and then moved on to BC and now Manitoba, which had a low levels of infection too, the inevitable just reached Alberta's shores.
I want to ask you, and it's something I've been asking myself a lot, and that is in Alberta, we have, as you mentioned, we've seen a real resistance in the political culture to mandatory measures. And we even saw, Dr. Dina Henshaw saying, no, we're pleased that we can ask people to do this voluntarily in Edmonton, in Calgary. Yesterday, she said it's not working, obviously. Is that voluntary approach, is that sort of the libertarian streak in Alberta, or is it also a consciousness of how bad the economy is faring and how much the impact is of mandatory closures?
But the thing about it is that without the pandemic is the constraint at this point to everybody's economy.
Yeah.
So the idea that the economy and the pandemic are somehow separate is an attitude that I would say was wrong from the beginning. This, this libertarian attitude also caused Jason Kenney to cut healthcare. Or cut healthcare jobs, excuse me.
Yeah, he's going ahead with the planned cuts
planned cuts to save $600 million, which, if this pandemic continues, is going to be more of a cost than $600 million.
Okay, I want to ask sorry.
So the idea that you're cutting public health and healthcare in the middle of a pandemic is just ludicrous to me.
Okay, one last question, because I know you're both chomping at the bit, and federal politicians no doubt are, but they're resisting. That is the perennial question we're trying to get. Reporters are trying to get reactions from the Prime Minister, from federal politicians. They've got it from some opposition leaders, but the Prime Minister has been scrupulous in not commenting on the American election, on the process, on the allegations, on the results. How do you think he's doing, and what do you think? What are you watching for in terms of the American politics and Canadians' reaction? Laura.
I think it's really interesting that we heard from the Prime Minister today a real focus on the institutions and faith in the American institutions, the election institutions and democracy. That's clearly a conscious decision to sidestep any political commentary and to resist any commentary on the crazed actions of U.S. President Donald Trump, or I don't know for how long, but his speech last night, his accusations, his baseless accusations about fraud in the electoral system. There's a lot that he can and should be saying right now, I would argue, but he is trying to keep his powder dry, the Prime Minister is, while the U.S. works this mess out. I wonder how much longer he's going to be able to do that and how much longer other world leaders are going to be able to resist as they see this erosion of democracy and these statements, these falsehoods being perpetrated by Mr. Trump, and when we're going to see other politicians around the world and in the United States stand up to that.
Okay, Erica, what are you watching for? I mean, a lot of people have asked, they've also postulated that. They said, well, what happens when Donald Trump, for example, might ask other world leaders to weigh in, or he challenges them to recognize him or whatever? What are you watching for?
Well, I don't expect Trudeau to say anything really, because he hasn't said anything for 4 years. So why would he say something now? I mean, he had so much opportunity and decided to sidestep that question. Honestly, I think Donald Trump has enough problems with his donors right now in terms of pushing forth this idea of going to the courts to somehow decide this election. A court which he conveniently has packed with his own sort of supporters. So I think the U.S. is an autonomous state. They can figure out their own vote count and they can figure out their own mess. It's not for us as Canadians to, although we do weigh in, let's be honest, but it's not for the Prime Minister really to weigh in and pick a side. That's just a bad look altogether.
Well,
stay neutral, stay away from it.
Well put, and I think he's taking your advice. Listen, Erica and Laura, thanks both of you for taking the time.
Thank you so much.